guys, this is chapter 8, key issue 2. Oh my gosh, chapter 2 was so long ago. And you should be back on the normal notes, not a worksheet, for tonight. So just do your book notes or notes from the guided notes that I give you on the website. Either one of those. Can you guys see Teddy? Say hi, Teddy. Okay, so we're continuing with our political geography stuff. Hopefully you have the differences between a nation and a state and the different types of states and nations down pretty well. So yeah, we're going to get more into like political conflicts and things like that kind of as we go. But lots of terminology. There's a ton of terminology for chapter 8. A lot of it's not in your book. So make sure if you're looking those up, you're typing in whatever the key term is and then AP Human Geography afterwards so that you don't get a weird definition. And your chapter 8 key term quiz is going to be a doozy. So just hopefully you're studying already. Okay, so something else that happens to states is a state can join organizations with other states, which we've kind of talked about when we talked about I guess a multinational state isn't really the same thing. So we're going to talk about supranationalism in a second. But the other thing that can happen to a state is it can break up into smaller pieces. And we call that, hiccups, devolution of a state or balkanization. So an example of this happening is in the Soviet Union, when that became no longer the Soviet Union and Russia just became Russia, and all of the different states that Russia controlled became independent. One of those states was called Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia is no longer a state. It is broken up into smaller independent countries. So that's an example of devolution. There's not that many examples. If you know Yugoslavia is the example of when a state breaks up into smaller states, that would be a good example to use. Usually this happens because of some sort of conflict, especially when we're talking about Eastern Europe. Oftentimes there's conflicts among different ethnicities. This was the case in Yugoslavia. Just too many different ethnic groups that did not get along were living together, and so those ethnic groups made their own states, and that's why Yugoslavia devolved, and now we have multiple states in that area. Do I have a map on here? I do not. Okay. Here's another example. An example would be Nunavut, okay, and that is a province in Canada, so hopefully you guys have heard of it because you guys had your Canadian test a while ago. So this happened when Inuit peoples, which was a native tribe in Canada, received their own territory in 1999. So it had been part of the Northwest Territories, which is right here. So this was all the Northwest Territories. And then in 1999, they split between the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. So the region is 85% Inuit people. So basically, we could maybe even consider that the Inuit people were a stateless nation living in Canada without a homeland. So eventually they got their own homeland. And having a stateless nation would be a big reason why devolution happens as well. And that's what lots of stateless peoples want, like the Kurds, they want Kurdistan. If Iraq and Turkey were to break up and create that territory in between became Kurdistan, that would be an example of a devolution of a state, or balkanization. Same thing. Okay. The other thing is territoriality. This can really happen with either a nation or a state. This has more to do with the land itself, okay? Nations are generally territorial based, so meaning people often share, so typically nations exist in one territory together. That's not always the case. If you look at religions, like the Jewish people as a nation prior to the creation of Israel in 1948, that would be an example of how that doesn't work. But oftentimes nations like the Rohingya tend to stay all together in a territory, right? And the understanding that your territory is your homeland and that soil of your territory is sacred, that's territoriality, okay? So an example would be Palestine lost a lot of land. The Palestinians lost a lot of land when they created Israel in 1948. And it might be easy for us to just say, well, you just go somewhere else, but they have a connection to that land. The reason Israel was chosen, the location of Israel was chosen, is because that, in biblical times, was where the Jewish homeland was. So they were, if you asked their opinion, they were there first anyway. Does that make sense? So that connection to your homeland, if you are so proud of being a Nevadan and you love this state and you would never want to live anywhere else, you have a connection to this territory. You couldn't be a Nevadan anywhere else because it wouldn't be the same. That's territoriality, okay? Okay. Really, the perfect situation is if you are a nation state, right? So if you have your homeland and the homeland is that territory that you feel connection to. Okay. The other thing is multinational states, which you probably did on your chart last class, but I guess we didn't do it in our last lecture. A multinational state is created when more than one distinct nation is found together in the same political state. Okay, so our example is Israel, which I just mentioned a second ago, and that is what you guys did your textbook out on, the creation of Israel. So, all of the green here is Palestinian territory. That is where the Palestinians live. As you can see, the red represents a wall. So they're basically walled. It's not so much that they're walled in, it's that the Israelis have walled them outside of the Israeli territory. Okay? So all of this area is considered a state. So because you have these two nations, the Jewish people, mostly Jewish people in Israel, and Palestinians in this green area, both existing in the same state, that's a multinational state. And because Palestinians don't have their own nation, they have Palestine, but that's, they would say that this whole thing should be Palestine because they lost this territory, right, to Israel. So, and there's actually lots of Palestinians that live outside of this West Bank area. So we would consider those people a stateless nation. Okay, so Palestinians a stateless nation. When we look at the Israel, the area of Israel, there's Palestinians, there's Israelis, two different nations within one state, hence a multinational state. Okay, that usually leads to problems. And as you guys saw from that textbook out, and we're going to talk a little bit more about borders and how borders cause problems. Multinational states are often sources of a lot of conflict. What happens is something called ethno-nationalism, a strong feeling of belonging to a minority nation that is contained within a state dominated by a more powerful nation. So in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Palestinians would be the ones that feel that strong sense of ethno-nationalism because they're not necessarily the minority nation in population, although that might be true, but they're definitely the minority nation when it comes to power. Israel's a more powerful nation, so they feel, they don't feel that connection to the Israelis, they feel the connection to their own people, right? This can lead to something called separatism, which in long term could lead to something like devolution, where people in Palestine might want the Israelis to leave and have that become Palestine again. That would be an example of separatism. When Yugoslavia, before it broke down into different states, those people who wanted their independent state felt separatism, okay? It's pretty easy to remember. It means to separate, right? It can lead to secession, the act of breaking away from, okay? Classic example when the South of the U.S. decided they were not going to be part of the U.S. anymore. That was seceding, right? Secession. And oftentimes this is not a clean break. Separatist movements are often go hand in hand with violence because They're usually the minority population. They usually don't have a lot of political power, and the majority power is not super good with the other people taking a chunk of their territory to make an independent state. So often leads to conflict, often leads to violent conflict. So that is something that happens. Okay. Irredentism is when a nation's homeland spills into another state, and the people on the wrong side of the boundary wish to join their territory with the rest of their homeland. Okay, so here's an example. Actually, India and Pakistan would be a great example, so I'm going to go with that. I'm not going to play this video because I think I might get in trouble for copyright, so I'm just going to explain it to you. So, I wish I at least had a map for you, though. India, the top chunk of India, here, you know what we can do? Let's just go on the internet really quick, and I'm going to show you a map of India. That way you can understand a little better. And some of you guys might already know this, especially if you did Hinduism for your religion project. This might be old hat for you. Okay, so here's a map of India. At one point, India and Pakistan together were all one country. What happened is that there was a separatist movement that happened in India. Hindus wanted their own state. Muslims wanted their own state. That was happening, but they were a British colony. But when the British decided to leave, they said, okay, and while we're at it, we're going to make two different states, okay? So that the Hindus have a state and the Muslims have a state, okay? So the Muslims were in Pakistan, the Muslim state is Pakistan, the Hindu state is India. Okay, so the problem is not all the Muslims perfectly lived in the area that would be Pakistan. Not all the Hindus lived in the south here in India. So millions of people had to switch and go to one country or the other country. Now this wasn't legally pushed. It's not like Hindus could not stay in the northern part, which would become Pakistan. It's not like Muslims could not legally stay in India. However, if you were going to stay, that meant that you were probably going to put up with a lot of persecution and things like that. So what happened is, going back to our slides here, lots of people in India were still Muslim, but felt like that was still their homeland. So like people in Pakistan who were Muslim, who had always been in the Indian area and not Pakistan, felt a connection to where they had come from, even though they were now living in a separate state. And vice versa. There could be Hindus who had lived in the north, in the area that would become Pakistan, who had moved to India to be with the rest of the Hindus, but still felt a connection to that land, that territoriality to the initial land, because they feel separated from their homeland, if that makes sense. Okay, so if we think of territoriality as the connection to their homeland, if you get away from that territory and you're separated from it, something you might feel is irredentism, that connection, that you still have that connection, but you're not physically living in that area anymore. Okay, and irredentism could also mean the movement to bring that all back together. All right, so separatism, devolution, irredentism, territoriality, lots of these feelings and events occur because of conflicts that are left over from colonialism and imperialism, which we talked about last class. We're really going to figure out in the next couple of days as we work on the partition of Bowman. If you are watching this early, then you don't know what that is yet, but we're going to look at what happens when you draw arbitrary boundaries, okay? Because what essentially happened, that's the end, which I'm going to show you in class as well, is all of Africa, as we talked about, in lots of different British colonies like India, Rwanda is also a good example of this, actually. Belgium controlled Rwanda. And when they leave, we have all these different ethnicities living in the same place that maybe before had been worked out by the colonial power and wasn't a problem. But now that they have left, which mostly happens after World War II, there's all these problems that occur. So, and another thing that happens when these powerful European countries leave is they say exactly what happened in India and Pakistan. Okay, well, since you guys don't seem to get along, we'll just make you two different states. But that doesn't work out perfectly because people feel a connection to where they come from. Moving away from that does not help any situation. So, just something to keep in mind. A lot of the problems we talk about in this chapter are just leftovers from colonialism and imperialism. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of what we're going to talk about the next semester, any issues that are currently happening in the globe, a lot of it can be traced back to colonialism, imperialism, and how the European powers did not leave these countries in very good situations. Okay, so that's key issue 2. Hope you took good notes. Hope you took good notes from the book as well as your lecture here, because there will most definitely be a pop quiz. All right, have a good day. I'll probably record another one for you right now.